My pleasure to introduce Adrian Jacobs, who will be leading us for the next 45 minutes or so. Adrian is a member of Six Nations and keeper of the circle at Sandy Salto Spiritual Center in Beausejour, Manitoba. So we're really pleased that Adrian can spend this weekend with us. He will have some involvement in the worship service on Sunday, and I believe a 12:30 session on Sunday as well. So we'll look to you, Adrian, and once again, welcome here. Delighted you're with us.
Thank you. It's good to be back. I was here and I didn't know that I was a part of an experiment in 2015 till I read the information about this meeting and realized that this is the second year. So that first year was the experiment. So, but I want to begin by giving honor to my parents. My dad's passed away now. He's passed away in 2010, so it's almost it's just over 7 years now. And my mother's still living, and I've been staying at her place while I'm visiting here in Southern Ontario with the rest of my family. My dad played hockey until he was 80. And he scored a hat trick the second last game that he played. So I'm really proud of him. And I'm wearing a shirt from my dad. I went through his closet and I picked out some things, and this is one of the shirts. It's a good traveling shirt. It doesn't wrinkle. So I can wash it up and use it real conveniently. So I always want to mention them as my parents. The name of this session, From the Hudson River to the Grand River and Indigenous History. And I wanted to just introduce myself by the names that I've been given. My parents gave me the name Adrian Dean Jacobs. Adrian is Italian. I'm not Italian. Dean is English, and I'm not English. Jacobs is Jewish, and I'm not Jewish. My cousin Beverly Jacobs says that her name, Beverly Jacobs, is her GST name. She's a lawyer, so I figured that's a pretty good way to say it. And but I was given the name Gunusano, which my grandfather says means Deer Lodge. And I'm of the Turtle Clan of the Cayuga Nation, Six Nations Haudenosaunee Confederacy, just downriver from us here. And I have 5 children. My oldest son is 28, soon to be 29 this coming September. And my youngest son is 20, and he'll be 21 this coming fall. And I have 3 boys and then 2 girls. And just wanted to mention that. And I have 2 grandsons. I've been able to visit with them. In fact, last night I went to visit them, and when I was helping buckle in the seat for my youngest grandson, I was leaning over my older grandson, and he says, "You smell." So it's good to be noted by my grandson. Last week I was in Jakarta, Indonesia, and I was meeting with some people from the World Commission on, or World Council on Mission, and there were a number of us from different places in the world, indigenous folks, people of color, and we were talking about decentering evangelism, not removing it completely, but talking about it in more terms than just the proclamation of words and the belief in words. More of an embodiment of what it means to embrace the good news. And really, I think that the fundamental difference that I've noted between indigenous spirituality and Western Christianity is this idea within indigenous spirituality of embodiment. It matters that we are meeting right here. It matters that we are in relationship at this moment. It matters that we're on this ground. We have relationship and connection with this context in which we are in. And our belief system is lived out right here. It's not just a set of abstract ideas that we all hold to that somehow is out here. Our respect is lived out here. If we don't live it out here, don't talk to me about it. Because it's just words. You can tell me all you want about respect or love or whatever, and I just say, well, I don't know it, I don't experience it, I don't know what you're talking about. People of color note whether there's respect or not. It's almost something you can smell. It's not something that you can actually just identify by pointing out certain things. It's like a spirit, and it's either there or it's not. And indigenous people, that is a fundamental characteristic of spirituality. One of the reasons why reconciliation events in the past have gone over like lead balloons in Native communities is because after everybody apologized, Native people were left sitting around the fire saying, "Where are my friends?" We had an event, and we didn't have a change of heart. So I think that that's very important. And while we were in Jakarta, Indonesia, I met a man from Tonga, one of the Pacific Island nations. And he's the president of a college in New Zealand, the first indigenous president, first person of color president of this college. And we talked about land. Whenever indigenous people and people of color from various parts of the world get together, we often talk about land. It's central to our understanding of who we are. There are two questions that indigenous people in Canada ask when they meet. Where are you from? And then who are your relatives? And I can tell if somebody has been born on a reserve in a traditional community, because when you ask them where they're from, they will cite that community no matter where they're presently living. I'm from Six Nations. I live in Manitoba, but I'm from Six Nations. Indigenous folks that have been born in a city, raised in a city, and have moved from city to city, cite the most recent place that they live. That's where I'm from, Winnipeg. Why? Because when you grow up in an indigenous community, the land really does mean something. It is sacred. I was driving through New York State, which is the homeland of my Cayuga people, and we lived all around the largest Finger Lake in upstate New York, Lake Cayuga. And when I was driving through that area, I felt a very strange connection to the land. I seemed like my being was reverberating with the land. And I thought about it, and I thought, the very molecules that made up my ancestors' physical being have been returned to the earth, and all of those molecules have been absorbed up into the plants. They've been eaten by the animals and returned back to the land, and eaten by people and returned back to the land, etc. And I thought to myself, my people are the land. And that's why I am feeling so connected to it. And our Haudenosaunee people describe future generations as faces that are coming from the ground. So that's a literal acknowledgement that we have been born of the womb of the earth. So our people lived in New York State and have come to this area after the American Revolution. And this was, all of southern Ontario was a part of our hunting territories. And I was at Five Oaks Retreat Center, just south of here, United Church Education Center, Retreat Center, just south of the 403, just a little bit east of Highway 24 and right by the Old Man River, and that flows into the Grand River. And when I was over there, Ava Hill, the present chief of Six Nations, opened one of the meetings that I was at there. And when she opened it, I had known of Ava, had not really met her before. I think she knew of me, and we had probably not, she had not known me from a personal dialogue. But when she got up, she said, I want to welcome everybody here in this meeting to the homelands of the Cayuga. And I'm Cayuga. And I thought, yes. First time I heard somebody acknowledge that this territory was the territory of my people. Because we crossed over the Niagara River and came through the lake and lived in this part of the world as well. And when I was in New Zealand, or talking to this president from New Zealand, who's from Tonga, he said, our concept of the earth includes the ocean. And then when I spoke to a couple of friends in British Columbia, some Indigenous elders and leaders in British Columbia, they said, when we speak of the land, we talk about the ocean and the rivers as well as the mountains and the valleys. And there's a saying in the BC coast that when the tide is out, the table is set. Nobody ever goes hungry on the West Coast because there's a tide every day. And when it goes out, there's enough food to feed you and keep you healthy. And so I want to talk about this world of ours and talk about the fact that it is earth and water, and we are earth and water. Everything that we have received from the earth is made up, and that goes into our body, is earth and water. Our bodies are mostly water, and then our bodies are made of the earth, the dust of the earth. And one of the reasons why Indigenous people are suffering high rates of type 2 diabetes is because we have lost our connection to the land in one area through our diets. Instead of the many things that we used to harvest from the earth that went into our bodies and that kept us in equilibrium with the land, we were excluded from the land, from the hunting territories and the harvesting territories, and reduced to living on small plots of land. And then our diet was given over to white flour, which we didn't have. We didn't use that kind of food, carbohydrate source. that's a European agricultural thing that was developed. So our bodies are still in the adjustment stage of all of that. In evolutionary genetics, they talk about the fact that it takes about 50,000 years for our bodies to make fundamental adjustments. And we're only 500 years into a very fundamental adjustment of our diets. And there have been several studies done of how that indigenous folks from different parts of the world had many sources of food. And then in the adoption of a modern agricultural diet, the number of sources of food is reduced. And when you reduce the number of sources, all of the trace elements, the trace minerals and other kinds of nutrients that would have been there in your body keeping you in equilibrium is reduced. In fact, they said that with the adoption of agriculture in Eurasia, people began to be shorter in stature and live shorter lives. So it was something that is evident in those very tangible ways. And one of the evidences of health is height. And among North American Native people, the Lakota are very tall. In Europe, the Dutch are very tall. It's an indication of good nutrition and good health, and it evidences itself in height. But in that agricultural revolution, there was a reduction of the hunter-gatherer kind of diet, and people lived shorter lives, and they became shorter in stature. So our bodies have been making that kind of adjustment. Now, this map here is the map of the Hudson River, the north-south river here, that goes down to New York City, Manhattan Island. And then the river going out to the west towards, that's Lake Ontario on the left there. And then the river going up to the northeast is the St. Lawrence. But that river that is heading towards Lake Ontario is the Mohawk River. And I've driven down that river and driven to some of the towns in that area. It's beautiful, very beautiful valley, beautiful river and beautiful territory. Our people used to, the Mohawk people used to live there, or their name for themselves is Ganyungahaga. I think Mohawk is like an enemy's name for them. Often Native people are known by the enemy's name that was given to us. You know, the Sioux comes from an Ojibwe word, Nadasu, which means little snakes. Their own name for themselves is Lakota. Or actually, the name they give themselves as the people is Oyate. And so, but the Mohawk people, the Ganyungahaga people, used to live in that valley. And so that's where they lived for a long, long time, and they harvested the foods in that territory, the berries, the nuts, the various things that they were able to utilize for food, and the fish, and the deer, the bear, other kinds of animals that were in the area where they harvested. And so, really, the Mohawk people have a fundamental resonance with that land and a fundamental equilibrium with that land. And during the American Revolution, did you know that the American Revolution was actually triggered by the Royal Proclamation of 1763? Prior to 1763, there were colonial folks and governments, individuals and governments, who were making treaties with Native people buying land. And there was a lot of conflict because of it, because treaties weren't fulfilled or deals were badly made, they weren't fully endorsed by the nations, etc., or whatever. There's lots of problems. So the Crown said, we're going to put a stop to all of this private land sale and private government sales. And we're going to create a monopoly on land transactions that are overseen by the Crown. So that's the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And it drew a line basically through the Appalachian Mountains, and it said everything east of that is English territory, and everything west of that is the Indian Reserve, they called it. Now, I argued at one time in a presentation at Massey College, Victoria University, back when Caledonia conflict was happening, and there was a Muslim person talking about social justice. I spoke and somebody else spoke. But I made a presentation on the Caledonia land claim, and I said the Royal Proclamation recognized our title to the land, that this was our land. And the respondent to our three presentations zeroed in on me. She was an appeal court judge in Ontario. And she said, no, that's not right. And basically what she said was that the Crown laid claim to all of our land, that they had the underlying title, that it wasn't our title. It wasn't a recognition of our title. And she didn't say it, but the Crown lays claim to our lands, including this land right here, by the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery comes from the papal bulls of 1453 and 54 and 1594, which gave Spain and Portugal the right to lay claim to all the lands of the pagans. So we weren't Christian, so we fell into the category of pagans, and so they laid claim to our lands. And the image of that doctrine is a European discoverer who sticks a sword into the sand at the shore, which is a symbol of the state, so Spain or Portugal, and then it was appropriated by France and England as well, the same doctrine. The sword represented the state, and then the bishop's crozier. And those represented the state and the church laying claim to these heathen lands. And that is what some of your churches have repudiated. You have repudiated. I know the Lutherans in the United Church, maybe the Anglicans, have the Anglicans too? You've repudiated the doctrine of discovery, which removes the Crown claim to our lands. Then whose land is it? Right here. Well, it's Greater's Indigenous title. Anyways, I won't go too deep into that. Need to bring you along a little at a time here. But because we had supported the Americans or the British in the American Revolution, those lands, actually that proclamation line went east or went west of the Mohawk lands. If you ever see the picture of the map, on the east side, therefore in British territory, 1763, are all the Mohawk territories. That's why at the end of the American Revolution, fundamentally, the British took care of the Mohawks. Six Nations is fundamentally a Mohawk reserve. But it's, others of the Six Nations are also mentioned, so all of the other Six Nations and the Delaware have moved there as well. But Tyendinaga is Mohawk. Akwesasne is mostly Mohawk. There's others there too. Ganawage near Montreal is Mohawk. Ganasatawage is Mohawk. Wata near Parry Sound is Mohawk. And so, the British felt, well, we lost that whole territory, and the Mohawks, our allies, lost their territory, so we will make compensation. So after the war was ended, they decided to compensate. This was the main compensation for the main body of Six Nations people, the Haldimand Proclamation lands, which this land is. 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from the mouth at Port Maitland all the way up to Dundalk. And most of the folks that were surviving the warfare with the Americans, American Revolution, were on the other side of the river from Niagara-on-the-Lake. On the other side, there was Fort Niagara. And so our people then, a lot of them came to the Grand River lands. I said before that all of southern Ontario is a part of the 1701 Nanfan Treaty, where we agreed to share the land with Anishinaabe people, the British, and ourselves. It was our hunting territory. We called it dish with one spoon, meaning that the land was going to feed us all. So the Anishinaabe, the people at Walpole Island and Sarnia and Kettle Point and Stony Point and Saugeen and Cape Croker and Curve Lake and Alderville and Scugog, Georgina Island, Arama, they were all welcome to this territory to eat of the land, in addition to our people, because it was our traditional hunting territory. And then the British. But what has happened is that we've been excluded from the land. And instead of enjoying the hunting territory of all of southern Ontario, we have been reduced to that little orange spot on this map, which is 46,500 acres of the Six Nations Reserve. That was the original tract that was surveyed out. Almost 1 million acres. So we have less than 5% left. And we understood leasing. We understood even the English system of land ownership, fee simple and all of that. So we were trying to do our best to be acknowledged within that system and maintain ownership of the whole territory. None of the chiefs had made the decision to violate all of the treaties of the past and sell the land. In fact, we're on one of the blocks here. There were 4 blocks, major blocks, from Paris up to past Kitchener, that Joseph Brant came and negotiated. It was supposed to be 999-year leases. It was a long period of time because part of the rationale was for the perpetual care and maintenance of Six Nations. You get perpetual care from a very, very long-term lease. And it remains your own, your land. If you're the lessor, you own the land. If you're the leasee, you're paying rent. That was the intention of the 4 blocks. That's what's in the writing for why such long leases were made. Because we knew that we had to go from this very expansive hunting and gathering way to an agricultural way. So what we did after the American Revolution, we invited good farmers to come and farm in our midst. Joseph Brant asked people to come. And they gave them life leases, 99 years, so that they could clear the lands, get the farming going, teaching our people how to make that transition. And then when our people grew and needed the farms, we had it right there because we're the lessors. We knew what we were doing. We understood you. We understood how your rules worked. And our intention for the whole tract was to lease it. And in the 1840s, a colonial official said, if the Indians are allowed to go ahead with their leasing provisions for the land, they will be the richest proprietors in the land. And the obvious colonial answer to that was, and that's not going to happen. So they made arrangements through a corrupt Indian agent, Samuel Jarvis, to secure the surrender of the land. And they brought Samuel Jarvis under question about this, and the actual surrender of most of the lands is a so-called minute that he took in a meeting with 6 men, 6 chiefs, and he was the one who took the minutes. And you know, from the Royal Proclamation 1763, in order for any land to be surrendered by Indigenous people, there had to be a map, a description of the land, there had to be an agreed upon price, and there had to be a full calling of the people and a voting of affirmation from the Indigenous people for the sale of that land. None of that happened. In fact, none of it happened for any of our territories after 1784. None of it. You know, the conflict that happened in Caledonia in 2006, that was put into the court system in 1987. So when we saw it being developed, in fact, my dad, when he would play hockey in Cayuga, there were just a few Native people that played hockey there, and most of them were other folks. And they loved my dad because he's, 70s, playing hockey with them, 80 years old, he's playing hockey with them. And there were some older hockey players with them. And they would say to us, you know that that's your land, right? In Caledonia, along Highway 6. In 1835, we agreed that that road could be built, called the Plank Road, 1835. And we said, we will lease half a mile on each side of that road through our territories for the people that are going to build that road. And they had to harvest the lumber to make the plank road for 21 years. And those leases will be renewed every 7 years. Suddenly, we find that it's sold and it's suddenly Canadian property, etc. And then in the conflict, in the negotiations, at one point the federal government came in and they made a big PR media event of trucking in 11 boxes, legal-sized boxes of paper that proved they're from somewhere after 1835, 1840, all of their crown patents and owners of the properties there along that road. And they had made a big show. And our people said, well, that's, good. You keep good records after. Well, we would like to see where we told you that we wanted you to sell the land for us. Because the last that we agreed to is what I just said to you about the leasing. Where did you get the instructions to then sell the land? And besides that, where's the money? Where's the record of the money? And if you've got the money and put it in the bank, where's the interest on it? Court system says you have to pay interest on old debts like that. Where's the interest money? And the federal negotiators, you know what they said? And this was reported in the Spectator, Hamilton Spectator. I read the Spectator report. In that report, they said the federal negotiators said, at this point, we're going to have to agree to disagree. And I said before, this is where the only time I wanted to have Judge Judy there. It's the Six Nations, you have all of these records. And the clear path of, instructions. Canada, you've got this and that, and you don't have these records in between that says you can do that. And they said you never said to do that. Gavel goes down. Back to them. Pay damages. The only time I want Judge Judy there. And then, as a further rationale, the federal negotiator said, we thought that's what you wanted us to do. Their legal defense was mind reading. And I tell you this with a smile on my face. Because if I don't laugh, it's just too hard to deal with otherwise. Because it's ridiculous. It's like Donald Trump. But anyways. When we first made an agreement with the Dutch and then the English and later the Americans, we made the two-row wampum. This white belt represents the river of life. It was actually the Hudson River. And they brought this out at the negotiations in Caledonia. Same thing. Same belt. And they told a story. One dark row represented the Dutch and their ship of state with their laws, their leaders, and their people. The other row was our canoe of state with our laws, our leaders, and our people. In between there were three rows. They represent how each would treat the other. First of all, the first row represents the desire for friendship. We were looking for friends. The Dutch were looking for trade. We wanted friends. The second row represents the peace that comes from respect. Not the peace of no conflict, the peace that comes from respect, where somebody demonstrates their respect for you, and you feel it and you know it. And then that third row represents the strength that comes when you've got right relations, because it's strong then. For 404 years now, from 1613 till today, we've kept this. The other side hasn't, except for some of you folk. And I appreciate that. And when our elders talked to us, they said, when you make a decision now, it must be good for the seventh generation. So I always think of my children. This is a picture of them in 1997. This is a more recent picture. I think it's maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And that's my two grandsons. So when I think about the future generations, I think about my grandsons, but I also think about my great, 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 great grandchildren. If the agreements that my people made in 1784 were kept, we'd still have control of that 1,000,000 acres. And we would have in our trust funds about $1 trillion. We would have our own health care system. You'd be sending your folks to us. Better than anything. It'd be better than Sweden. Because they made good decisions. They figured out how British society worked, and they made decisions back then, and that's what would be mine if the agreements were kept. So whenever I hear of people saying, oh, all these Indians don't pay taxes, where did my $1 trillion go? Where did my 1,000,000 acres go? Besides that, where did Southern Ontario go? When people say, oh, we have to pay so much for you, we're giving you so much money, that's only a small portion of what is already mine, what is already ours. You're not giving us anything. And that's what the TRC calls to action were all about, this history. Everybody up and down the Grand River needs to know this history. All you need to do, if you want more education, go to sixnations.ca, go to the land claim negotiations, and 29 claims will come up. And you can read about every single one of them. And our land claim is the most documented probably in all of the world. It's in your universities. I've read the books. Go to Queen's University. You'll find all this information there in great detail about all of those Indian agents, Samuel Jarvis, Peter Jarvis. There's a Colonel Claus as well. And their shenanigans are recorded. It's great reading. And you know what? You have to own the dark side of your history if you're ever going to come to the bright side. Our people about 1,000 years ago were killing each other. But a peacemaker came to us and said, this is not the way we should live. And taught us to listen to one another, to open our hearts up and to help each other grieve and to be made whole again. And we still remember that. That's where the original 5 Nations Confederacy came. And then in 1701 or so, 1721, the Tuscarora joined us. I am going to be here for this weekend, so I welcome your questions. Throughout you see me in the hallway, just go ahead and ask me. Don't be afraid, because I've heard it almost all. And your question might be all.
Adrian, on behalf of this group, thank you for this very disquieting, uncomfortable history lesson that invites us into this space of friendship, respect, and right relationships. And so grateful for the time being with us. And certainly would encourage you to, we don't have time now, but for you to pick up Adrian's invitation to continue the conversation throughout this weekend. Just so you know, on this stage, yes. I trust that you receive that applause, Adrian, as a sign of our solidarity and desire to stand alongside you and with you. Main stage here at 10 o'clock, Black Lives Matter with Sally Hudson. In the Market Building, Brian Mitchell-Walker will be doing a session on the Enneagram, and in the Agriplex, Brian Moyer-Suderman, a music concert for all ages. And then in the Edge Tent at 10:15, Stronger Together, Right-Left Reconciliation. Also to note, this afternoon there will be art in the main field, and in the evening the main field will also have a blanket exercise. And if you are a child at heart, you may want to visit the bouncy castle that will be arriving for 1 o'clock this afternoon, just out to the, I guess it would be the right of the Agriplex. So would invite you to move to the space and the events that are drawing your attention from here on in.
Good morning, Skylight. I hope you all are having a great morning so far. We're starting to wake up a little bit, I think, and powering through the day. So we have an amazing speaker coming up here on the main stage, somebody I'm so excited to be welcoming today. One of the issues that was raised for us last year at Skylight was to be more inclusive of Black folks and their stories. And I think as I've come, some of you will know I'm from the States originally, but have been living in Canada for the past 6 years. And something I've observed is in the church world and kind of even more broadly in the culture, we can do a really great job sometimes of criticizing what's going on in the States around police brutality, mass incarceration of Black folks. But we do not always do a great job of looking at our own history and privilege here in Canada. So I think it was really important that we invited Black Lives Matter here today to speak, and I'm so thrilled that we're welcoming the co-founder, Sandy Hudson. So I'll talk a bit about Black Lives Matter first. They are an international grassroots organization, so we have a local chapter here in Toronto that Sandy's affiliated with. And they do great work of advocacy and education around Black liberation and breaking down some of the injustices in the laws and the policing system and things like that. And Sandy herself is a student at the University of Toronto. She's obviously a very sought-after speaker. She's often on different news programs and was just on CBC, she was telling me, representing Black Lives Matter. And she's also a podcaster. Sandy and Nora, is that, yeah, that's a podcast. You can find it. I'm trying to think what else to mention in her very accomplished career here, or the Black Lives Matter group. Is there anything else I'm really missing? Okay, she's going to tell you a lot about it. That's what she's here to do. So without any further ado, let's welcome Sandy with a big round of applause.
Hello. Thank you so much for welcoming me. I'm going to move this away because I like to walk around when I talk. So I thought about what I would tell you all today, and I like to talk about the work that I do in terms of stories. I think that stories are very important. I think that stories are very instructive. And I think the different stories that I have to tell you today will tell you a little bit about why my organization exists, how it started, why we're necessary, those types of things. And I think it's also very important to do this in this tradition because a tradition of storytelling is very, very important to my community. In the Black community, that's a tradition that has existed for centuries and is something that I want to stay true to. So I'm going to start by telling you a number of stories. I'm not going to start with the story that I would typically start with because I've got a lot on my mind this week. Have you folks been watching the news this week in Toronto about what's happened to a man named Devontae Miller? So for those of you who haven't heard, and I'm happy to hear that most of you are nodding and have been paying attention to this case, I think that this particular case demonstrates so clearly why something like my organization is needed. And I start with this story because everywhere I go, whenever I encounter skeptics, the number one thing that I hear is, Black Lives Matter, that's something for the United States. In Canada, we're so different. In Toronto, we don't have that issue. That's not something that we need to worry about. And that's really how we like to think of ourselves as people living in Canada, as better than folks in the United States. But the reality is not, that story is mythical. The reality is not that. And so I'll start with the story of Devontae Miller. So Devontae Miller is a 19-year-old youth who is walking around Durham region, which is nearby Toronto, at night with some friends. And two people approach Devontae Miller and ask him if this is his neighborhood. if he lived around there. He refused to answer. So one of those, or these two people, Michael Thériault and Christian Thériault, have a steel pipe somehow and chase after these young men, nearly boys, they're 19, and one of them can't escape, and one of those boys' names was Devontae Miller, the one who couldn't escape. And he beat him with that steel pipe. And during the course of this beating, Devontae Miller calls the police for help. The person who's beating him takes his cell phone and says, "I am a police officer." He was off duty. "I am a police officer. I'm taking care of an arrest right now." So, okay, this police officer is off duty. So he's in plain clothes. He's with his brother, and he's beating Devontae Miller and has told the 911 operator that he's effecting an arrest. Now, he's a police officer in Toronto, a different jurisdiction. So the Durham region somehow send their police anyway. And during the course of this, they decide to arrest Devontae after he's been so badly beaten that his nose is broken, his jaw is broken. He is about to have surgery to remove an eye because his eye was destroyed during the course of this beating, and his wrist is broken. They arrest him for theft and a few other things that I can't remember. All of these charges were withdrawn in the initial preliminary hearing because they were without merit. Now, this happened in December of 2016. We're hearing about it now, not because the police did an investigation as to what happened with Christian and Michael Thériault, not because the Toronto police or the Durham police did an internal investigation into what's happened, not because the Crown, who decided, oh, these charges are without merit, we're going to withdraw them, are doing an investigation, because Devontae Miller's family hired a lawyer who said, oh my God, I have to call the Special Investigations Unit, which is, of course, the watchdog body in Ontario that is meant to keep police accountable. His lawyer called the Special Investigations Unit. That isn't something that has happened before, that the Special Investigations Unit has started an investigation against police officers because a civilian has called to say that something's gone wrong here. So now the SIU is investigating, and they say, oh my God, this is awful. We need to charge both of these people, the civilian, Christian Thériault, and Michael Thériault, the police officer, with aggravated assault. And then they say, but why weren't we called in the first place? The SIU is supposed to be called anytime a death happens with police officers, either on duty or off duty, anytime someone has serious injury, and I don't think anybody can argue that his injuries aren't serious, or if there's a sexual assault. But they weren't called. So in the news, have this lawyer, Devontae Miller's lawyer, Julian Faulkner, saying, why hasn't this happened? Why am I the guy calling the SIU? Well, the Durham police say, well, it's a Toronto police officer. It's their responsibility to call the SIU on their police officers. SIU director says, that's not really true. You're supposed to call. You have an obligation to call us when something like this happens, regardless. But okay, Toronto, why didn't you call? Police Chief Mark Saunders says, well, we did an internal investigation, and we thought that because the police officers didn't actually identify themselves as police, they weren't wearing police uniforms, that there was no reason to call the SIU. It was kind of like a non-police thing. But of course, he did identify himself as a police officer on the 911 tape, and that's quite obvious. And then it turns out that the investigative body that made that decision in the Toronto Police Services, Michael Thériault's father works in that department, in the internal department that made the decision about whether or not any wrongdoing has gone down. And then yesterday, the headlines were Chief Mark Saunders saying, "It is not a cover-up, I promise." Like, come on. You know, this is coming at a time where I've had the wildest 2 or 3 years of my life because there's just been so much heightened work, heightened pressure, heightened visibility over all of the wrongdoings that have been going on with respect to police brutality in the city of Toronto and outside the city of Toronto. And for them to do something like this, knowing that people are watching them very closely, means to me, I think it tells me, that they know that there's very likely that there won't be any consequences for something like this. It means that the system is very, 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 very broken. And for too long, we've had politicians who do one thing only, and that's, we're going to announce a review. There will be a consultation. We need to study this. We need to really find out what's going on here before we can take any action, because they're afraid. Maybe. I'm not sure if they're afraid. I just made that up. You know, like, it could be something else entirely. Maybe they just don't care about Black communities. Maybe that's closer to the truth. But either way, a very strong supporter of a lot of the politicians who are currently in place right now is the police union. And that makes it very difficult for civilians to say this type of thing needs to change, and for a politician to listen. So the only way to really affect change, when we need that type of change, is to unite with people at a grassroots level and to start mobilizing. Which brings me to my next story, which is how we began. So in 2014, 3 years ago now, just at the end of August, a man named Jermaine Carby was killed in Brampton by police officer Ryan Reed. The circumstances of that police slaying of Jermaine Carby were very strange. Police officers will tell you that, you know, they were doing a routine traffic stop, which, by the way, it's not a real thing. That's something that you hear sometimes coming out of the States. Like, I don't know, I know there's some people here who've lived in the States, so you can tell me if that's a real thing that they routinely stop people. I know I've heard that on the news. But that's not a real thing in Brampton and Toronto. That's not something that the police do. There's no such thing as a routine traffic stop. However, they say that this was a routine traffic stop of Jermaine Carby. The way that the police tell the story is that he then, during the course of this routine traffic stop, comes out of his vehicle pulls out a knife out of his pants, an unholstered knife out of his pants, but there was no cuts on his body or anything like that. Pulls it out. It's a kitchen knife, apparently. Starts pointing it at the police, so they shoot him. 2 years later, during the coroner's inquest, because that's how long it takes to get a coroner's inquest, we find out that not only was there no knife at the scene when the SIU arrived, but it's okay, the police brought it later to the SIU. They were like, oh, we forgot to log this with you at the scene of the crime. Here it is. A knife that doesn't match any other knife that's in Jermaine Carby's house or his parents' house or where he, you know, his siblings' house. It's just a knife that apparently came out of nowhere. But we also find out that he was shot in the back, which is really strange for someone who's pointing a knife at you to be shot in the back, isn't it? So that happened in August of 2014. There were a couple stories about it on the news, but not very many. And then in September, Michael Brown from Ferguson was killed. And that killing sent shockwaves across the United States, across Canada, across the world, really. And people started organizing around the Black Lives Matter name a little bit more furiously than they had before. And I was frustrated about what was happening in Canada because we were seeing all sorts of stories on the news about Michael Brown. And there should have been. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be. There should be. We should know about all of these things wherever they're happening. But there wasn't that type of attention paid to what happened to Jermaine Carby, a very similar case of someone who had been, by eyewitnesses had been said to be running away from police officers, someone who by eyewitnesses had been said to have their hands up. In both of these cases, this has happened, and a police officer shooting both of these men, young people. The Black Lives Matter in the United States called for people to organize vigils across the country in advance of the decision as to whether or not the police officer, Darren Wilson, who shot Michael Brown, would be indicted. And that was happening in November. So I decided that I would look around and see who was doing a vigil for Michael Brown in Toronto, because typically this type of thing will spread to Toronto. We'll see some sort of organizing happening in Toronto around it, and I didn't see anything. I didn't see anything at all. And I was having a conversation with my little brother, who isn't little. I have to call him little because he'll never not be my little brother. I was having a conversation with my little brother, and he was like, he was distraught. He was very, very angry and very sad, and was telling me, somebody has to do something about this. And I was like, yeah, you're right. And he says, well, I'm actually talking about you. Like, you have all of these organizing skills. Like, you've been a student organizer for so long. Like, why can't you do this? And I was like, well, I don't know. I don't know the first thing about this particular work. I just know that I'm angry. And he was like, well, I think that's a cop-out, Sandy, but, thanks for talking to me. And I was like, you know what, he's right. Like, why don't I just try? I can see if I can get a vigil together. So I contacted as many organizers that I knew who were also concerned about this type of thing, Black organizers, and I said, look, let's have a vigil, but let's not just talk about Mike Brown. Let's make sure that everybody in our community also knows about the issues that are happening here, that the media is, for whatever reason, less willing to show us, because our media buys into this mythology of Canada being somehow better than the United States, so much so that even when the evidence is staring them straight in the face of what's happening here, that they refuse to show it. Let's do that. And so that's what we did. We decided that we would organize a vigil outside of the U.S. consulate in Toronto. We would see how many people we could get. We really organized it in just 2 days. In advance of the decision not to indict Darren Wilson, the officer who killed Michael Brown. And we contacted Jermaine Carby's family, and they were a part of it, and we made signs and literature to make sure that we could distribute to everybody in the crowd so everybody would know about what was happening with Jermaine Carby, and Jermaine Carby's name would be on everyone's lips. Now, I'm a pretty good organizer. I'm not like I don't have false humility around that. I'm a good organizer. I know what I organized for. I organized for about 50 people to come out to a vigil. We had some Timbits, we had like candles, whatever, it was going to be a small little to-do. And 3,000 people came out. We organized it in 2 days. 3,000 people came out to the U.S. consulate, mostly Black people from everywhere in the city and outside of it, came to grieve together, to mourn together, to share joy. We had some moments of just what it meant to be together in that space at that time, at such a time of sadness, and to just organize together. And afterwards, those of us who had organized it got together and were like, oh my God, 3,000 people when it should have been 50. We've really tapped into something that's actually missing here in Toronto. People knew about Jermaine Carby. People knew about this being an issue. But we thought it would be irresponsible of us to just stop at that point when people so clearly were waiting for a mobilizing force. And so we continued. And in that story, which is the origin story, there's a lesson, I think, about waiting. So often we're waiting for someone else to like take the helm, to change the world, to do the thing that's going to change everything, that's going to bring our issues to the light. But we can be those people. There's nothing stopping us from being those people. I don't know why, I was so nervous to be the person to say this has to stop, but I shouldn't have been. Any one of us could have done that, and I hope that that's a story that inspires you if you're worried about something in your particular local context, that's something that's been on your mind, that I hope that you take up that helm as well. There's no reason to wait for somebody else to do it. We can do these things. That story also touches on something else that's very, very important, and that's the media. And how important the media is in all of this, in this issue of anti-Black racism, and how Canada sees itself, and how Canada mythologizes itself. And what I've learned over the course of the last 3 years, and the media, it's interesting. Like my particular strategy in organizing is to often use the media to get our point across, to see it as a tool where we can distribute our message as widely as possible. So if you manipulate the media in the right way, they'll tell your message. But what I've also learned is that the media is, wildly not ready to deal with our issues. And we knew that way back when we had first started and we started talking about anti-Black racism, and the media would be like, sorry, what? Like, what are you talking? You said anti-Black racism? Why are you separating? Isn't it just racism? And we had to do a lot of education to these journalists about why anti-Black racism, an issue of anti-Blackness, is actually different than just racism on the face of it that anybody would experience. But now, 3 years later, it's very common. Now the mayor is talking about anti-Black racism, where, 4 years ago he was saying white privilege doesn't exist, right? Like this is the work of getting your issues out there, of refusing to just, back off when someone says, I don't know what anti-Black racism means. I'm actually not going to include that in my newscast. That's the work of just sticking to it. But this next story will talk about just how unprepared the media is to deal with some of these issues. So Andrew Loku is another man who was killed by Toronto police in his home. There was a coroner's inquest that concluded just about a month ago. And in that coroner's inquest, we discovered all sorts of really terrible things. He was a man who was in mental distress, and he was making noise in his apartment building, which was reserved for people who had mental health issues. He was, under the care of an organization. And he was making noise because he was angry about another neighbor who had made noise. Okay, so he was really angry and was reacting to that. And that other neighbor called the police. The police arrived. You could hear in the 911 tape. You can hear the police arrive. They arrived very quickly. The person who's calling is saying, he's making a lot of noise, blah, blah, blah. The police arrive, and within 20 seconds of you hearing them saying, sir, he had a hammer in his hand, put down the hammer, and then you hear shot, shot, shot. And the person is still on the phone. And that person starts screaming and saying, why did you do that? Why did you do that? You didn't need to do that. And the operator is like, what's going on? It was outrageous. And then you see in the video that the police officer arrived at Andrew Loku's apartment with his gun already out. He was always intending to do something as soon as he saw him. And this is an area where a lot of Black people live. What was interesting, what was significant about that coroner's inquest is that it's the first coroner's inquest that has a set of recommendations at the end. And so the purpose of a coroner's inquest, the stated purpose, is to find out how the person died and to make recommendations as to how to prevent such deaths in future. So the jury makes recommendations. So what was significant about this coroner's inquest was it's the first jury that's ever acknowledged anti-black racism as something that needs to be addressed in the police killing of a black person. So the organization that Andrew Loku had been under the care of working with Across Boundaries, which is an organization that works with racialized people who have mental health issues, they were holding a press conference at the end of that coroner's inquest to talk about the significance of the decision, of the recommendations that had been made. The CBC had a journalist who was there to talk about it, and Across Boundaries invited Black Lives Matter to come and talk about our own reactions because we had been really instrumental in elevating his case to a national level. So we were there just to provide some comments at the end. And I did that. At the end, I went up and I talked about how frustrating it was that a coroner's inquest is the only thing that you can really do after a police killing, after the SIU has decided, the Special Investigations Unit has decided not to charge a police officer, that all we've got is this coroner's inquest where recommendations are made that are swept into the dustbin of history because most of these recommendations never get implemented. And that was my comment. The journalist, strangely, did not ask any questions to the folks at Across Boundaries who are not black. He just said, "I want to talk to you." And he pointed at me. And I was like, "Oh, okay, that's really weird. This isn't my thing, but cool. Hi." And he said, "I just want to start off by saying you are extremely articulate. You're so well-spoken." And so for folks in the audience who may not be familiar, this is something that black people often hear from it's just so weird, like, as though there's an expectation that I wouldn't be articulate or well-spoken or something like that, and that would be a compliment to say, "You can speak very well." And that's something I've heard many times in my life, and it's kind of an underhanded, it's a racist statement, quite frankly. Anyway, he starts off by saying, "You're so well-spoken, you're so articulate, which is why I want to speak to you." And then he tries to destroy everything that I said, which is really weird for someone who thought that I was so well-spoken and articulate, but also is really weird for a journalist who's meant to ask questions. What he did was he said, "You're so well-spoken, you're so articulate, but I don't think you really know how coroner's inquests work. Do you know that their purpose isn't to solve issues?" I was like, wasn't that my comment? Like, I don't know if he heard me. "Do you know that their purpose isn't to solve issues? Their purpose is to investigate how somebody died. So they're not going to solve the issue that you have." And he's speaking to me just like this, right? So I'm articulate and well-spoken, but I need to be talked to like a child. I think that you might want to consider focusing your attention on, the police or the SIU. Has your organization ever thought of that? Now, how marvelous it must be to be a journalist that gets to be so mediocre that you don't know anything about who you're talking to at the time that you're asking these questions. Of course, all of the work that we've done is around the SIU and the police, and have in fact managed to affect a number of policy changes at the SIU level in just our mere 3 years of existence. But here he is asking me if I had ever considered focusing my attention on the police and the SIU, and you don't know what you're talking about, and you're so well-spoken and articulate. So I was like, whatever, I could get really angry, but I'll just take this in stride and I'll just answer the question. I was like, if there's any assumption that we haven't been doing that work, I'm not really sure how it's happened, but I will give you a summary of all the work that we've done. Here you go. And, I think I do understand how coroner's inquests work. You can read an article that I've written about it in tvo.org if you'd like. This is what I meant. One of my team members was not going to let that go, though. She came up to the mic and she said, "I'm sorry, I just want to stop the proceedings for a moment because I'm really frustrated about what you just did. I think it was really inappropriate. I think that you should be careful when you're talking to people who are, quite frankly, in a state of distress and going through a lot of trauma when we're talking about these things. And what you've tried to do is invalidate everything that Sandy said. And I just think that that's really inappropriate. And I think you should think about that. And just so you know, if you're going to call someone well-spoken and articulate, you should really think about how that comes across to black folks who are told that time and time again when we're simply just speaking. It's not, we're just speaking. This journalist said, "I am not a racist." That was his response. Raven, my team member, very graciously said to him, "I'm not calling you a racist. I didn't say that you were. All I said was that you really need to think about how you've approached the situation. And I think that what you've done is inappropriate. And I didn't think it was okay to let this go." Now, I should tell you that this is a press conference, so there's an audience there, an audience of people who are very much like, as this is happening. And he says, his response to Raven saying, "I didn't call you a racist," is, "I am from Burundi, and that is in Africa." So this is a man who's not listening. He's got all sorts of conversations that are happening within his head or in his body that he's not really hearing what we're saying. Raven says, "That's really wonderful for you that you're from Burundi. I really still think you should think about this, and that's all I have to say." And then he says, "Well, I have no further questions for you." And we're like, okay. The press conference continues. Afterwards, after the press conference, he approaches the executive director of Across Boundaries, this organization that Anchiloka was working for. And he says, "Just so you know, I will no longer be filing a story with the CBC about this coroner's inquest and about what you say is such a significant issue because I was so offended by the way that I was treated today. And you should really think about who you have speaking at your press conferences." Can you imagine? Well, yeah, I can imagine too. Like, this type of stuff happens all the time. But he is now blocking information from going out, and this is the CBC, so blocking information from going out to millions of people about a man who was unjustly killed by police and about a coroner's inquest that for the first time has said racism is a significant issue in the health of black people, in the killings of black people by the state. He is no longer going to file a story going to millions of people because somebody told him what you said was inappropriate at a press conference. As someone who was wildly unprepared to even address the story in the first place. He didn't do any history, like any research on the history of the issue as he came to speak to us. And this is just one example of many that I could tell you of how how the media are wildly unprepared to deal with these issues. And that's why when we say so often that there's an issue of racism here in policing, in our schools, in healthcare, that the media so often just won't bite. They won't talk about it. They're very resistant to even hear the word racism, let alone talk about it. Have you noticed that when you read about racism in the paper, it's often in scare quotes? It's racist, or someone called it racist. Or they'll say, this seems like a racially charged incident. Anything to avoid the word racism or racist. It's because our media, which is largely very, very white, is very unprepared and super resistant to talking about this really uncomfortable issue of which they know they are very much implicated in. And that's part of the issue. The next story I have to tell you is a story about sticking it out. Did any of you hear about the tent city that we ran? Yeah? So let me tell you a little secret about that will no longer be a secret because I keep telling the story everywhere I go. The secret about that action, and I'll tell you about it for those of you who don't know about it in the audience, is that we only meant for it to be 6 hours. So Tent City was a 15-day occupation of the Toronto Police Headquarters. And that occupation came at the time that the SIU, the Special Investigations Unit, decided not to, again, charge the police officer who killed Andrew Loku. They released that information at 7 p.m. on a Friday night. And for those of you who know about the communications world, there's a reason why people release information at 6 p.m. on a Friday night. Or at 7 p.m., on a Friday night. It's to make sure that you've missed all the 6 p.m. news time slots during the week, and to make sure that all the big stories that come across the headlines Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday won't come out because papers generally already know what they're going to be putting in their big Saturday and Sunday issues. It's not something that's done on the Friday night. So they were trying to bury the story. So this comes out 7 p.m. on a Friday night, no warning to his family, no warning to his community. It was like a kick in the gut. And immediately, I remember I was like getting ready to go to a party. It was a Friday night. And the person, Andrew Loku's sister, calls and is like, this has happened. And we get on a call. We all cancel our plans for the night. We get on a call and decide, like, what are we going to do? What should we do? We have to respond to this in some way. And one of our team members is like, did y'all see what happened in Minneapolis recently? In Minneapolis, there was a tent city that they did to respond to, that the Black Lives Matter Minneapolis chapter did to respond to a police killing. Maybe we should do something like that. And I'll just tell you about our team. None of us camp. We're like, does anybody even have tents? Can we make this happen? I'm not sure if we actually have the ability to do this. And we wanted to do something that would make sure that it would make the Monday news cycle, so we needed it to happen, whatever we were doing, in 2 days. And I was like, so we don't have any tents. We don't know anything about running a tent city. Like, I'm not sure if this is something we can do. Let's get a community meeting together, see how many people can help us with something like this. So we made a call out for a community meeting for the next day. I think about 30 to 40 people came to this meeting, and were like, we want to do, at that time, Afrofest, which is the biggest African music festival in North America, was also cut down from 2 days to 1 day because residents in the Beaches neighborhood of Toronto were complaining, saying that it was too loud. But just so you know, there are all sorts of music festivals that happen right there that are way longer than Afrofest. So I don't know if it was the music was too loud or if it was like the type of music that it was. It's probably the second. So people were like, what would be really good is if we created like a mini Afrofest during the day. We just took the stage at City Hall and we just did our own little Afrofest. And then afterwards, let's try to do this tent city thing, but we'll just put a timeline on it. We'll just, we'll stay until just after midnight and then we'll pack up and go. Great. So that's what we decided to do. We get all sorts of people to bring us the materials that we'll need, and we get a whole bunch of food together and all these provisions to make sure that people would be safe. It was a huge, huge project. I didn't sleep for that weekend. And then we put it together. We ran this Afrofest during the day. It was wonderful. There was all these performers. And we had Jermaine Carby's family speak. We had Andrew Loku's family speak. We educated people on the issues. We told people about what the policies were at the SIU that needed to change, what the City of Toronto could do. It was wonderful. A few hundred people came out. And then we set up our tents, which we had decorated with the names of people who had died at the hands of police, but also institutions that had died as a result of, or that were under attack as a result of anti-Blackness. So Afrofest, there's a program at the University of Toronto called the Transitional Year Program, which is a program that was started by the Black community to allow a different pathway if you didn't have the traditional qualifications to get into an undergraduate degree and so on. So we did that, and we were at Nathan Phillips Square. And then the police came at, I think, 10:30 or 11 p.m. So imagine this, okay? It's winter. The police come, and they're like, you're a disturbance. You must, leave. Like, you can't have this space. But there's also, if you've been to Nathan Phillips Square, there's, like, a huge skating rink. And they're like, you're a nuisance. You're too noisy. We've had several noise complaints. But the skating rink also plays really loud music. It's like... And we can't really hear them because the music is so loud, and they're like really far away from us. And we're like, sorry, we're annoying. People are complaining about our noise. We were just sitting there literally singing songs. It was like a camp, and there was, there's this huge skating rink, and people are out skating, and there's all this music. It was outrageous, and we were like, this is weird. We're just gonna keep doing what we're doing. And then they came out in full riot gear with horses. There's about 50 of us just sitting in Nathan Phillips Square, and they came out with about, I'd say, 100 cops in full riot gear with horses and their paddy wagons, and they started like advancing like a military force, and we were like, okay, this is really weird. We didn't expect this type of response. What should we do? Should we just end it early? We were going to end in 2 hours, but I guess, should we just end it now? And the people who were with us were like, no way, like, this is ridiculous. We've got to stick this out. And I was really nervous because I was like, look, no one can see us. The way that Nathan Phillips Square is set up is that we're really far away from the street. Like, I really think this could get dangerous and violent, and I don't want people to be in a dangerous, violent situation. I don't think we prepared for that adequately. And then people were like, okay, so let's move somewhere else. Let's think, what's safer? Like, can we go to Queen's Park? It's like, that's kind of far from the street, too, and it's really dark over there. And someone's like, can we go to John Tory's house? I'm like, yeah, like, maybe, but that's, like, private space, and, you could definitely get arrested off of private space. And some of the people who are with us, are, international students or don't have permanent status yet. And then someone was like, well, what about Toronto Police Services? I was like, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. It's a really safe spot. It's right on the street. It is very well lit. There's a lot of space right at the front to set up a whole bunch of tents. And it makes sense. Like, here they are attacking us. Let's go to their house. So we, and Andrew Loku's sister was just like, yeah, let's go. So we packed everything up, and they thought that they had won. They were like, haha. And we went there. We made sure to call the media first, so that they would meet us there, and there would be cameras by the time we got there to keep us safe a little bit, because the police can't really do much when there's cameras. And by that time, our supporters were just they were like, we're staying all night. And we were like, oh, okay, yeah, so we're staying all night. Yep, we're going to stay all night. Didn't really think about this for food, but let's see what we can do. Got some food for the morning, and we stayed all night. And then I didn't take any time off work. I went to work in the morning. I was very tired. Went to work in the morning, came back, and I was like, what happened? Not only were there tents, but now there was like a food station set up. There was a whole food station. I was like, what's going on? And there were about 100 people there now. People were like, we're sticking this out. We're not going to move until there's some changes that are made. And I was like, oh, okay. This is not what we thought was going to happen. It is freezing cold. This is February. And we were like, all right, so we'll do this. By this time, the police are really agitated, and they've decided that the whole thing needs to come down. So that night, after the news cameras had left for the night, except one that they didn't notice. One city TV camera. They attacked the camp. They removed all of our tents. There were children there. They beat people. We had a little fire that was going, and they told us that was illegal, and they called the fire department. The fire department came and was like, oh, this is totally not illegal. This is something that can happen. They can do this. We're given the A-OK. Okay, bye, guys. They left. And then the police were like, it's still illegal. They put out the fire in the face of someone who was, like, standing near it. And so the steam came up, and that's when they attacked people, and there were children being dragged on the floor. It was outrageous. So after that, I thought, okay, we probably are going to need to shut this down. And they left. The police left. And people were like, we're staying forever. It's like, oh, wow. And all of a sudden, that night, 500 new people came to the camp. I went to work again the next morning, very tired. I come back that night, and not only is there a kitchen, we've got a microwave set up now. We have heaters. We had a health station. We had beds set up for people who needed to take a rest at the health station. We had a choir that was set up during the camp. We had a movie station. We had all sorts of things. And what it really ended up becoming, which I think there's a lesson in this story as well, was not just a protest, but it was an imagining of what a community that really holds itself together could look like. Everyone had a space in that camp. It wasn't just for black folks. There were people who were, black folks were of course centered because this was our protest, but everyone was helping to keep this thing alive. There was, on the Wednesday I came back from work and we had 200 umbrellas because someone had heard that it was gonna be freezing rain and so brought a bunch of umbrellas. We had street involved people who were part of this camp as well, who had mental health issues, who would just come because they thought, they saw the food and they saw all the things happening and they joined our camp. They were part of the choir. They were part of helping us with the morning exercises. It was incredible. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. I miss it a lot. It was just so wonderful. And at the end of it, when we finally decided, the community decided, we've been rained on, hailed on, there's snow and everything, it was terrible. They decided, let's pack up. I think we've made our point. And the government then announces a major review of the Special Investigation News Unit, that they're going to finally release all of the investigations that they've done against the police, that there's going to be a huge consultation process that started. John Tory acknowledges anti-black racism exists and also announces a consultative process that has started and is finishing up right now. And, we were going to end it in 6 hours. But the importance of sticking something out and believing in a community that is committed to making that type of change is so important. So I'll leave it there. There's so many other stories I can tell you, but I want to be able to have some question and answer. I'm sure that people have some questions for me. But I hope that some of these stories tell you a little bit about anti-black racism in Toronto and Canada, but also give you a little bit of inspiration for some of the stuff that you might be working on in your own local communities. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, any questions? Just let me know and then I'll... Oh, come on. Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah. Sure, you can also ask hardball questions. I'm great. Yeah, there's so much really great community media that exists in the Black community for sure. We've got papers like Share and Pride, which are community newspapers that publish our stuff. But in terms of something that's relevant for folks who are organizers in the crowd, I think that something that's really important is creating your own media in where the media fails. So last year during Pride, we did this really little thing that became the biggest thing ever. It was such a little thing that for us, was probably the thing that took the least organizing of anything that we've ever done. And it didn't feel like what it became while it was happening. And it became this huge, huge thing. And the media had we're salivating over, okay, we hate them now. Before we liked them and we hate them now. And they were, saying that Black Lives Matter has lost all of its support, it's not, whatever, blah, blah, blah. It was kind of hilarious from our point of view. You know, it wasn't like for us as though the goal was ever to have some sort of media love us or something like that. That was never the goal. We always knew that that was something that was bound to happen soon. You just need to be savvy enough to turn it around. But during that time, what we did, if you take a look at our stuff on social media, was we created a lot of our own media. We started creating our own videos to present our message in the way that we wanted to. And those videos went viral super fast because people were really, really wanting to hear from the people who did what they were seeing on the media. And we weren't saying yes to all of the interviews because we already knew they had their own slant, so we weren't going to be on the news that much. But so we created this video that, you know, within 3 days had over 1 million views. And then all of a sudden AJ Plus is calling and is like, we want to do a video with you to talk about what you did. And then we did a Facebook Live that had, I think, about 80,000 live viewers, and then afterwards had over 1 million views. Creating your own media is really important where the media fails, where people can go in directly to the source and hear why you did what you did. And slowly, after that 1 week, the media itself was shifting its narrative, starting with a really great reporter at Global News who was just like, oh my God, I watched your videos and I totally get it now. Can I talk to you in a different way about this? And then we started doing interviews again. So I think that really taught me how important it is to make sure that we do our own media, make our own media when you're doing any sort of organizing. Be prepared for, you know, if you're trying to change a system that most people in your society are really comfortable with, they're probably not going to get it when you're talking to them about it. So it's really important to create your own media that's going to be the venue for people to really understand what you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. So the question was whether or not there was a difference between the experiences of the Black community in the GTA and other racialized communities in the GTA, but also within Black communities, like the different communities within the Black community. Yes, there is a difference in experience, I would say. I think one of the hallmarks of anti-Blackness is that is something that you experience from any community. Any community. It's not like a racialized, non-racialized thing. It's like you will experience anti-Blackness from racialized communities as well. You will sometimes experience anti-Blackness from within Black communities. And within the Black community, of course, there's different experiences from people who perhaps came to Canada from the Caribbean during the 70s when there was a lot of programs that were encouraging people to come up to be workers in a particular way, or people who came perhaps from East Africa in the 90s, often as refugees. There's a different experience that happens there in the way that you arrive to Canada, as well as the people who've been in Canada for hundreds of years that are often forgotten by Canadians, who are the descendants of slaves, from enslaved people who were here in Canada. So those are like different, there's going to be different experiences from those communities, and different things that we're all focused on working on with respect to anti-Blackness. But in our organizing, we try to tackle all of those things. So we're talking about the experiences of migration and different types of migration, border politics, talking about history lessons for Canadians who don't tend to know that there was enslavement here, which is like, how do you not know that? Like, there wasn't like a line drawn forever between the United States and Canada that was like, racism here, no racism here. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And making sure that people know that history is also really important. Yeah. No, not at all. Because in fact, I think that those things are often related, especially like the intersection between folks who are Muslim and Black There was a case of a man who, and just so you folks know, like Black Lives Matter, when the cases that we elevate is only when we have a connection with a family and permission to do something, because we don't want to re-traumatize a family who's going through something. So there was a case of a man that we didn't elevate because his family was going through a lot. We supported them in the ways that we could in Mississauga, who was shot at. He wasn't killed. He was going through a suicidal episode, and he was wearing a vest, and he was Black and Muslim, and visibly so from the description of the police officers. And so he's wearing a vest, and he's going through a suicidal episode, so he calls the police himself to say, I'm a danger to myself. And then they arrive, and they shoot him because they think he's wearing a suicide vest. But it was cold. It was like one of those just puffy vests. And so I think it's actually really important to talk about how those things intersect. And I also think, and some of the work that I do as a student at the University of Toronto, the research that I do is around decolonization and anti-Blackness, because there's an intersection there too. The colonization project was both about land, but also about resources, and the extraction of those resources. One of the major tools to extract those resources were Black people, Black labor. And so it's really important as Black folks to work with Indigenous communities around a decolonization project that includes anti-Blackness as one of the things that we talk about. So when we set up Tent City and did the occupation of police headquarters and even Nathan Phillips Square, one of the first things that we did was we raised a Six Nations flag, and that was raised by the folks from Idle No More who were helping us with the space. And every morning to get the space ready, the folks from Six Nation would cleanse the space doing a smudge, and we would talk about Indigenous issues as part and parcel of the issues that we were fighting for. And shortly after Tent City ended, some folks might remember that there was an occupation of Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. It was called Occupy INAC, and that was something that we also, after Tent City ended, there was a lot of energy that was there from everybody who was there at the camp, and Indigenous folks were really instrumental to the work that we did, and they called us and they were like, we're doing another occupation. We're like, hey, cool, we're really tired, but we're there, we'll be there. And we helped to set that up, like not at the forefront because that's not our thing, but we were like, what can we do? Like, can we help you with press releases? Can we help you with printing costs? Can we help you with getting people there? Do you need rides? Do you need food? What do you need? In the same way that they were there for us. And that type of solidarity, I think, is very, very important. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the question was about funding, like how are we funded? It's like really individual donations in addition to organizational donations. So unions are really supportive. The United Church has been really supportive. We've got different nonprofit organizations who've been really supportive. But we're not like a charitable organization or anything like that, so we can't get any sort of like gifts in the same way as like a real organization would. But during Pride, when we had supposedly lost all of our support, was when we made literally, and I kid you not, $30,000 in 3 days from donations of people giving like $25 to $50. And I was like, so when I say that we thought it was funny what was happening on the media, like it was so funny because we were just like, my phone goes off every time we get a donation, and I was like, my phone is going off the hook. And the media is like, everybody hates them now. And I was like, I don't know, guys. I don't think it's really like that. And like during Tent City, there was a wonderful thing that happened where people, it was so cold that there was an organization that donated like 3 vans to just be outside so that we could warm up in every once in a while. And then people brought all these Tim Hortons cards so that people could get breakfast in the morning. And when I say that people brought Tim Hortons cards, we had $10,000 worth of Tim Hortons cards, okay? It was like, it's the individual donations. It's literally just people coming together and saying, I want to support you. That's where the money comes from. Sometimes it's harrowing, and we're like, oh, the bank account's getting a bit low, but, people generally have come through to support us, and that, it's been such a wonderful experience how people just come together for us. Good question. If you wanted to contribute directly, there's a few ways. So on our website, which is blacklivesmatter.ca/donate, there's a few different ways that you can. You can either donate through an e-transfer, which is that Interact thing where you can send an e-transfer to us, and it has information there as to what the password should be and so on. So just check out that page. We also accept PayPal donations, so you can donate using your credit card on PayPal, or you can send us a check in the mail if you want to do it that way. So those are the three ways to do it, and it's all there, blacklivesmatter.ca/donate. I think this means I'm out of time. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
After such an inspiring talk, I hate to cut you off on the financial logistics of it, but I know that that's very important to you all as well. So I am just so challenged by your words and reminded today of the power of stories and facts in the midst of what you call mythology and that kind of narrative that we're trying to undo and interrupt. That's a great word. And creating this other kind of community. That's what we're trying to do in a small way here at Skylight, and hope to be continued to challenge to do. So let's have one more applause for Sandy Hudson and Black Lives Matter. Yeah. Great, and so just to let you know, coming up here next on the main stage, Zarka Nawaz in the first of her two presentations this weekend. Theater of the Beat will also have a workshop coming up in the Market Building, and Matt Epp will be giving another musical performance in the Agroplex. If you didn't get a chance to see him last night, or if you want to see him again, check that out. Okay, thanks everybody.
you good to go? Okay.
Now I am.
Okay. Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Who is as excited as I am to hear Zarka Nawaz speak? As the program team planned and tried to look at our schedule and imagined what types of contributors we could have, we were so excited when we were able to be in touch with Zarka and confirm that she was able to be here with us. So it is my pleasure, my joy, to welcome Zarka Nawaz to Skylight 2017. How many of you ever watched Little Mosque on the Prairie? Lots of hands, yeah. So you know from reading Zarka's bio that she was the creator of Little Mosque on the Prairie, the world's first sitcom about a Muslim community living in the West. She's a filmmaker, a writer, a comedian, and a mother. I asked Zarka a moment ago what kind of interesting thing, fun fact about herself I might share with you all as I introduced her. That might not be in a written bio, say, and she said, well, my kids don't think I'm very fun or interesting. So I'm sure that over the next hour, she's going to prove her kids wrong, and I am looking forward to hearing this session, laughing all the way to the mosque. So please join me in welcoming Zarka Nawaz to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? All good in the back? Thank you for inviting me. This is so wonderful to be here today. I was just telling, so I didn't get your name. Harold? I'm the reason tech guys get heart attacks, right? Their lives are calm until I show up. And then it's just like, and my poor 16-year-old son has tried so hard to make this as like idiot-proof as humanly possible, right? That nothing can go wrong. And yet every tech guy that I meet has to go through this whole rigmarole and, you know, but you look like you're in good health, so you didn't need to bring out your anti-glycerin pills or anything, right? No, we made it, and I have this Prezi, and I'm sure it's going to work for you guys because it's kind of fun to have pictures to your talk. And so this is a mosque that a friend of mine drew for this presentation, a typical Canadian mosque, and I wanted to talk to you guys about it. So the question is, how did someone like me end up coming here to talk to you guys about, you know, my journey in faith and comedy and what brought me here to you? And it's a long story, but it's an interesting one. And I would have to say it probably began back in 1947. Because in 1947, India, which had been colonized by the British, the British had decided that they were going to split the country into two. And before the British had come, Muslims and Christians and Sikhs and Hindus had lived in relative peace. But as what happens with colonialism, a conquer and divide philosophy comes in, and all of a sudden overnight, as my father told me, because he grew up in India, you know, he had neighbors who were Hindus and Sikhs, and they lived in peace, and they were you know, knew each other, and they cared for each other, and they looked after each other. But once England made that decision that India was going to be split into a Muslim Pakistan and a Hindu India, it changed people's attitudes overnight. Like all those separations that come up in terms of differences of faith were suddenly exaggerated, and people started killing one another. And people were no longer safe anywhere in the country. And my father's family they were Muslim, and they lived in India, in what was then designated as Hindu India. And so the killings began immediately, and the family had to move. My father said they just like fled to refugee camps as fast as they could, taking nothing with them. They had to leave their land and their jobs and their possessions and sometimes even babies behind because they had to run as fast as they could. They would live in refugee camps and then be put onto trains and transported to what was then going to become Muslim Pakistan. And even then, my father said sometimes the trains didn't make it. They would be stopped and people would be killed wholesale. And this was going on in both sides, both for Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs. And so my father was 15 years old at that time. And this was a very traumatic moment, to have everything, destroyed in his life and, suddenly move to another country with nothing. And at that point, my father, he was the eldest son in a family of like 6 brothers and sisters. And culturally at that time, he was expected to look after the family as the eldest male. And he realized that his family was going to be, plunged into poverty forever in that time period because jobs and the economy was not great when countries go through such upheaval. And so what was in his heart was that if you could get an education, then that could never, ever be taken from you. People can take everything away from you, that's material, but if you could become educated, that was one thing that could save his family. So he was really smart, and he was very technical, and he got scholarships to go to university, and he became an engineer. And at that time, ironically, England, the very country that had caused the problem, was looking for engineers to help rebuild parts of England after World War II. And they were looking for the type of engineer, the civil engineers, particularly concrete specialists. If there's any concrete specialists out there, I grew up with endless criticisms of concrete. If there was ever a sidewalk or a wall with a crack in it, my father would be there going, they did not cure this concrete properly. This could have been avoided if only those silly people had an engineer there. So, I mean, I grew up with all the concrete information. And there's a place in England called Liverpool, and they were building something called the Mersey tunnels. Are there people out there that seem to be knowing what I don't know what a Mersey tunnel is, but it changed the whole trajectory of my life. They were looking for concrete specialists to help build these tunnels in Liverpool. So my father went to Liverpool to start working on these tunnels, and he worked for years in England. He was in his 30s, and he was sending every cent back home to help raise his younger brothers and sisters. So much so that, his parents wanted him to get married and have a life of his own, and he was very, he had come from such a traumatic background. He just felt, once you make money, you just have to keep making it, sending it back home and helping your family. And so he was willing to sacrifice his whole life for that, so he refused. So his parents said fine. And one day he got a telegram from Pakistan saying his father was very ill and most likely wasn't going to make it, and he should come home at least, to say goodbye. So he rushed back home to Pakistan, only to be greeted by a band and a wedding ceremony and a shiny new bride. And this is the way they did it back then. It was like an arranged marriage, but like old school arranged marriage where you didn't even know you were getting married, right? And in that time and place, my parents, I just boggles the mind, right? When I ask my parents, how, in that time and place, you couldn't say no to your parents. That was it. They made a decision about your life, end of story, right? I'm sure there's a lot of parents here who feel that's probably a better system, right? To get your kids married. And so I guess family reunification used to be really fast back then because he was able to bring his wife right back to England, and his friends were quite amazed that he went, His father apparently was fine, there was nothing wrong with him, and he had a shiny new bride, because it had been a complete ruse because it was the only way they could get him to come back home, right? He wouldn't come back home any other way. And so, let's see if this works. Yes. These are my parents. They didn't have time to take photographs in England. It was in Pakistan because the wedding had been so fast. So my mom said once they got to England, she dressed up in her wedding clothes and had an official photograph taken. So this is my parents. And so they settled in Liverpool, England, and a year later, guess who was born? I was cute, right? So that is how I wound up being born in Liverpool, England. A lot of migrants from India and Pakistan went to England first and then came to Canada because that was our route back then, because it depends on which country was looking for immigrants. Eventually, England started to shut down the doors of immigration and family reunification, but the country that was looking for immigrants after England was Canada. And so that's how we went from England to Canada. And so my father, as I was one of 3 children, but the only female and the eldest. And as I mentioned, he was obsessed with education, like obsessed beyond obsessed, because of his very, very traumatic background. And because I was a female, he became extraordinarily obsessed with education because he told me that his younger sisters, when he left for England, he was hoping to send money home and get them educated. But back in that time period, people felt marriage was a way to keep women safe. And so he realized his younger sisters had gotten married early and they hadn't had a chance to go to university. And that had always really bothered him. His whole life, he felt women were always stronger and smarter than men. And he felt that if they had had a chance to have gotten married, have gotten educated, they would have never needed to get married, because he always believed marriage was a failure in life for women. That was what happened when you couldn't get an education. And he said for his own daughter, marriage would never happen. It would only be education. and I would go far, and I would make my own money, and then there would be no reason to get married. It was a very strange way of growing up with a very conservative Muslim father who was sort of channeling like Gloria Steinem, right? Like men are the worst things in life for women, and he just like this was like a mantra growing up, right? Don't ever get married. Men are the worst thing on earth, right? Because anytime somebody would come and visit us, he would immediately say to her, "Are you educated?" And if she had a degree, he'd be like, "Oh, you have a BSc? Why didn't you get a master's?" And of course, what had stopped her was that she got married and had babies. And he goes, "See, I told you." Or if she had a master's, why didn't you get a PhD? And of course, it would always be she had gotten married, right? And if she had a PhD, in economics or something, why aren't you the head of the, economic? The UN, right? Aren't you running the UN, right? It would be like it was like a mania with him that if she just hadn't gotten married at that moment in time, she could have gone here or here or here. And he would just go on and on. Like every woman that came through our door would always be stuck with this, this crazy man who was always telling her, if you just hadn't married him, this guy who can barely read or write and is literate, right? And he would be insulting all these poor husbands, and my mother would just be like, "Oh my God." And so I grew up like almost brainwashed with this thing, but I had to get educated and I had to go far in life. And what do you guys think is the number one career choice for immigrant dads when it comes to their daughters? Yes. Medicine. They have some obsession with medicine, like some crazy obsession with medicine, because they believe that, once you finish medical school, you can get a great job and a 6-figure salary and you're set for life. And you'll never need another man again. And so that's what I drank the Kool-Aid, and I was trying really, really hard to get into medical school. And I did great when I was in high school. My marks were amazing. But then I got to university, and my lack of technical prowess started, affecting me, because things like organic chemistry and statistics and physics and those courses were really hard. And I felt my heart and mind being drawn to the arts, and I couldn't quite get you need like 90s to get into medical school. It's intensely competitive. And I started feeling my attention starting to wane. And my father, he kept pushing me and pushing me. He goes, "You can do it, you can do it." And I applied to medical school, and I didn't get in. And it was just like the most shocking thing of my life, right? Because I had been bred since I was an embryo for only one thing, and that was to become a doctor. And then to suddenly find out in your early 20s that you're not going to get in. And this was like back in the days when you couldn't be sent off to the Caribbean or to Poland or wherever they send kids to now, if you can't get into North American schools. So if you didn't get into medical school, that was the end of the line. Like there was no other options. And so I was just like in shock because I didn't know what to do. I had no plan B. Sorry, my nose runs when I talk. I don't know, it's a thing. It's a problem, right? Anyway, if I was a doctor, I know why. It's true. My mother, in the meantime, who was like waiting in the wings, who did not believe marriage for women was a failure, who didn't believe her own life had been a failure, was like, "I have a plan B. Let's talk about getting you married." And so suddenly, all these men started showing up. Because my mother had this network of aunties across North America. This is how my Pakistani aunties work, right? Everyone talks to somebody else and goes, "I've got a single guy, I've got a single son, and conveniently enough, there's all these PhD candidates from Pakistan who moved to the US who are there on who just need a citizenship with benefits, right? And so they all started showing up in my living room, right? And I was like, "Oh my God." They're like, "We'll get married, then I just have to do my 2 years in Karachi to fulfill my, the Pakistani government had paid for their PhDs. We'll work there. You'll love Karachi." And I was like, "Oh, I'm going to wind up as a housewife in Karachi if I don't pull it together really, really fast," right? So I was like, "I can't do this. I can't, it can't just be medicine or a housewife in Karachi. Those cannot be my only options in life," right? So I was like, what can I do with my life? And my best friend was always talking about the arts and becoming a novelist and writing plays and making films and movies. And to me, I had always, I had gone to Muslim camps with her similar to like this one. And I would always listening to her and I thought, being an artist, like that's not what good Muslim girls do. Like that's for like racy women who wear like lip gloss and like, fishnet stockings. Those are for those type of women, not for people like me. I'm a good conservative Muslim woman. But I was also someone whose options had finally come to an end. And the only school that was still accepting applications after medical school rejected me was Ryerson. Back then it was called Ryerson Polytechnical Institute. And I applied, right? I applied and I got an interview. And it was a bit shocking because I didn't, obviously I hadn't spent my whole life writing for newspapers. I had a zero resume. I had nothing, right? And so the guy who interviewed me was an elderly man, and he said to me, you know what? You are the only applicant that has applied with a BSc. Everybody else here has a BA, which is why I wanted to interview you. I found that was very odd. And I said, well, you know what? My whole life, all I've ever wanted to do is become a journalist. And I knew if I was going to stand out from the pack, I would, instead of getting a BA like the 1,000 of other people, I would go and get a BSc to be different, to stand out. It wasn't that, the guy was just like, amazing that you had the foresight to think like that. I know. And he goes, well, I said, if I have a science degree, I can write about science subjects in your newspapers and magazines, because everyone with a BA, what do they know about science? Someone like me could really help out. And he's like, this is so true. And based on that, he let me in, you guys. I got into the most prestigious journalism school based on nothing. And that's when I knew I had the ability to tell story. And I got in, and I started to thrive in journalism school. This is the place I probably should have gone 4 years ago, but it had never occurred to me or my father that there was such a thing as a career in journalism. And I did really well in journalism school. In fact, I won. Make sure I don't fall off the stage, guys. I was in Stuart McLean's radio broadcast class. The late Stuart McLean was my instructor. Back in those days, he used the top journalists used to teach at Ryerson, and he taught my radio broadcast class. So I was in his class, and he taught me how to write story. And every year in his class, the person who was voted as the best documentary maker went on to the Ontario Telefest Awards. And so the class voted me as the best person. So Stuart and I went to the Telefest Awards, where I won in my category and then won overall. So they were going to take a picture of me and Stuart together, because, this was a proud moment in my career. And I feel this tapping on my shoulder. And it's my mother. And I said, Mom, you can't be in this picture. And she goes, yeah, neither can you. I go, why? She goes, if a picture with you and a white man gets out, we'll never be able to find you a good Muslim husband. So this is not possible. People will think you've had an affair with him. Right? She made me move, you guys. I could not believe it. And they put someone else in the place. 20 years later, Stuart McLean, during his Vinyl Cafe tour, he came to Regina, Saskatchewan, where I live now, and I told him the whole story, right? I said, this is what my mom did to me. And he said, okay, well, we have to get you your picture. I sent it to my mother, who said she didn't care because I was married now and my husband's problem, right? So that was how I got into journalism school. And I started doing really well, as a journalism student. And because I had won that award, I got placed on a show called Morningside with Peter Zosky. Do you guys know? Oh, it's so good to talk to people who've heard about these shows. The person who wins the top award at Telefest gets a six-month internship with Peter. So I was working as a producer on his show, and he's amazing. He's an amazing man to work for. He would do, you would find people for him to interview, come up with all the questions, and then he would do the interview. And he would make magic on air, and it was just incredible. But what I was learning very quickly was that Peter was the one who was having all the fun. And I was the technical person behind interviewing people and writing out all these questions. And there was something inside of me that was burning, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Like, what was it? There was some sort of creative energy that wasn't being fulfilled being a journalist and having other people tell, their stories. So I asked a friend of mine, I go, probably I should have gone to film school and become a filmmaker, but I don't want to, and I've done 2 degrees now, I don't want to yet go back to school and do another degree. What do you do? And she said, why don't you take a 3-week summer workshop? Because filmmaking is kind of like plumbing, right? It's like if you can do it and learn on the job, now that's what you need to know if you actually have the skills. And so I took a 3-week summer workshop at the Ontario College of Art. I think they still have it. It's just 3 weeks, you get to make a 5-minute film. You're put in groups of 5, and you rotate. One week you're the director of your own film that you wrote, and your other people are the sound and camera and all the other technical people, and so you make a film. So I thought, okay, I make a 5-minute film to see if I'm worthy of being a filmmaker. And it was I believe it was 1993 at the time. I had a baby in 1994. This is how we do it, right? So, was she born? No. She was born, so it had to be 1995. Sorry, guys. She was 1 at the time. So it was 1995, and I was trying to think, I need a topic for a 5-minute film. What would it be? And, I was thinking about all these things, and all of a sudden, the Oklahoma bombing incident happened in the U.S. For those who don't know, the Alfred P. Murrah building, which is a federal government building, blew up. A man went in with a truck bomb, blew it up. There was even a daycare, and children died. So I think 168 people died. It was the single biggest domestic act of terror in the United States. And immediately Muslims were arrested from all over, the U.S., put on, I remember seeing their pictures in the newspapers, and they were being taken off airplanes. And then 3 days later, Timothy McVeigh was arrested. And it turned out he was belonged to a right-wing militia who was anti-government, and he was trying to topple the American government. And at that time, suddenly all the attention swung away from Muslims to this right-wing movement happening in the U.S., where there were these right-wing extremists who were angry at the government for their mishandling of the Waco crisis that happened a few years earlier, and they were trying to assassinate members of they were trying to either assassinate members of the government or destroy the government by causing, incredible harm. And so nobody really understood this right-wing movement until, this started happening. And I thought, wow, this is so interesting that all the attention had been on this one group, yet there was this other group in the United States that was equally, as worrying. So I thought, I'll make a film about this to open up people's eyes and say we can't always be staring at one group when we have other groups that are also dangerous. And so I made a film called Barbecue Muslims, and it was about a terrorist group called the Barbecue Anti-Resistant Front, who was going around blowing up barbecues because they were angry that they were releasing carbon into the atmosphere and causing climate change. They were ahead of their time, right, in 1995. And they thought the only way they could bring attention to the cause of climate change was to blow up the barbecues in people's backyards. And so they were doing that, except they accidentally blew up a Muslim's barbecue, and the police arrested the Muslim brothers who owned that barbecue and said, you are Middle Eastern terrorists. And these guys are like, but wait, we haven't even been to the Middle East, right? It was just our barbecue, and somebody else blew it up, and we don't understand why. But they don't care about their explanation, right? They're like, it has all the marks of, Muslim terrorism, dead animals, big hole in the ground, charred grass. We don't need any more evidence. You're going to jail. And meanwhile, the right-wing extremists are like picketing in front of the police going, it was us. It was us. We are trying to bring attention to the cause of global warming. And then they're arguing with each other going, why did you blow up a Muslim's backyard, a Muslim's barbecue? Of all the barbecues in suburban Oakville, which is where I shot the film, why a Muslim? They're like, because barbecues are not labeled by ecumenical affiliation. We don't know which faith group owns the barbecues. They're just unlabeled in suburbia, sitting there. Our job is to just blow them up. If we had just known that a Muslim owned this barbecue, we would have never touched it. But they're not. They didn't leave us any indication. And so they're arguing, fighting in front of the police station, trying to get attention to their cause, and no one's paying attention to them. And so, the Muslims, meanwhile, are being arrested. So I made a short film called Barbecue Muslims. So it was actually done in my parents' house, and I used all the neighbors that lived around my parents. And so that's the anti-barbecue front that's fighting and arguing in front of the police station. And at the very bottom, that's the picture I drew of the 2 suspects. Right? And then, of course, I thought it was worth an Oscar, you guys. I submitted it to the Toronto International Film Festival. A couple of weeks later, I get a very irate phone call from the programmer of the Toronto International Film Festival. And he's like, you know what? There are going to be so many filmmakers who will be angry with me that I have accepted this film, because people submit technically perfect films, and then there's you with this. And, I was a little insulted because I thought it was pretty good. But he's like, because, they were the neighbors, right, who couldn't act, and it was just my, student crew, and needless to say, it was pretty rough around the edges. He goes, but I cannot deny the fact that you are the first person ever to submit a satire about terrorism. We have never seen anything like this before, so we are compelled to program it, right? And he programmed it, and it's on my website for those of you who are curious how bad it was. I actually, for the first time, had my film digitized and downloaded, so if you go to zarkanoaz.com, you will find it, and you can watch it. And what was amazing to me was being at the Toronto International Film Festival, and people were laughing. People were laughing because I hadn't actually written it with the intention of it to be a satire or a comedy, but the actors had figured it out, right? And they were ad-libbing and adding their own jokes and lines to it. And so people were laughing, and then even people who had their films before me and after me were afraid of this film because they're like, people are laughing so much, it makes my film look less interesting. And so that's when I realized, oh my God, I can write satires about very serious subjects that are happening in the world and bring attention to them in a way that you can't bring if you're serious about something. So they said, listen, the Toronto International Film Festival said, we gave you one shot, right? But this is your last shot. Next time, we expect a proper, technically, superior film to this thing that you've submitted to us. So I said, fine. But because they let me in, I was able to cobble together money through all the arts boards because I could say I had an acceptance at the Toronto International Film Festival. I got together, and back in those days, we were using film, right? There was no such thing as digital in the late 90s, and film is very expensive. It took, I think that my budget was like $30,000 to shoot just a 20-minute short film on actual real film. So I did that, and I made a film called, I think I have a terrible poster of it. It was called Death Threat. This was based on, the news about Muslims is always negative, right? Always crazy and negative. And I think, do you guys remember Salman Rushdie and Taslima Nasreen? And so the news was full of how Muslims, always give fatwas of death to writers. So I thought it would be really interesting to write a comedy about a Muslim woman who writes a terrible, terrible book. Like, it's so terrible, nobody will publish it. And so she decides to cash in on her Muslim card and try to get a fatwa of death from the local mosque so that people will pay attention to her and she'll attract a publisher. So she figures all she has to do to get someone to sentence her to death is go out there and vandalize the mosque and do terrible things in the community, and eventually someone will say, she's so crazy, let's sentence her to death. So she starts to do all this stuff, but the only thing that's happening is that they're trying to, they're repairing the mosque, and they're making appointments to see a psychologist, and she's like, this is not working, I need a real terrorist to sentence me to death. So she reads the local newspaper, and there is a group, the Hamas, is in town having a men's-only lecture at the university. So she's like, oh my God, I'll go there. And she writes up her own $3 million bounty. She wears a niqab, right, so that her identity will be hidden. She goes to the Hamas meeting, and she reads the poster and realizes she had misread it. It's actually a cooking class for hummus, right? And she's like, damn it. She's like, well, I'm not going to give up. So she sees the chickpea delivery guy coming, and she pays him with cash. And when the cooking instructor opens the door, she hands him the death threat and goes, here's your receipt for the chickpeas. Can you sign it? He signs it, thinking my delivery person looks very odd today, right? She takes it, gives it to the media, and goes, I've been sentenced to death by the hummus chickpea guy, right? The hummus instructor, for violating the rules of Islam, right? And, the media doesn't care what reasons. It's a bit weird, but who knows? Muslims are weird, right? They'll do anything. And so it goes, crazy and goes viral. And so So this was the comedy called Death Threat. And it's also available. I don't want to ruin the whole thing for you, but it's available online. So then I made this film. So at this point, I kept making kooky films. This one, Random Check, was about a Muslim guy who gets random checked on his way to the airport, on his way to his wedding, because he had been out of town working, gets random checked, and then sent to Guantanamo Bay, where they were trying to get him out. It's also available online. I could go on and on, but I think I have a time limit, right? So I wanted to get to the end. Fred's Burqa, that was about a small-time hood who steals money from 7-Elevens because he takes too many loans, and the loan shark is after him, and he needs one more heist. But his what do they call the nylons over his face ripped, the stocking. And so he's like, oh my God, I have to quickly get money before the loan shark comes. And so then his next door neighbor wears niqab, and I love niqabs. And so she's like putting on her laundry to dry, and he steals it. He's like, oh my God, who invented these things? They're like so perfect, right? And so he, long black robes and a face veil, and he goes and tries to take over the 7-Eleven, rob it, but he can't get the gun out of the robes because that's the one thing because the robes are so voluminous, right? And of course, it's like a young Indian man who thinks like, oh, it's a woman under the robes who's come to propose to him because she's acting so crazy, right? And he's like, yes, I accept the wedding, I accept it, right? I accept your proposal. And he's like, no. And so he runs home where the loan shark is waiting for him, beating him up. But of course, the young man who thought that was his future wife comes and rescues him. But anyway, so it's making these... So it's making very kooky comedies, right? Very, very kooky comedies. And so the National Film Board rescued me. They're like, listen, we know you can do this. This you can do till the cows come home. But, let's do something more serious, right? Give us something that's more serious that's happening in your life, which you could be funny about. And so, I had moved from Ontario to Saskatchewan at the time. And there had been, at the mosque, I don't know if you guys have go to mosque, but, we pray in a large kind of cavernous area, and men and women pray together in the same space. But there was an imam from Saudi Arabia who came, and Saudi Arabia has a very peculiar culture. It's very, very patriarchal, and they justify their patriarchy through religion, even though there's no justification in the faith for the things that they do. But they say, oh, Islam says this is to justify essentially patriarchy. And they say, it's a literal interpretation of Islam, which I argue with them because I'm like, it doesn't actually, none of the stuff that you're saying actually exists in literature, so you're making this stuff up. So, of course, we get one of these guys showing up in our mosque, and he's like, oh, women, because they live in this sort of weird parallel society where they like to keep women in the back, hidden all the time. And he's like, there should be a curtain. If you have to have women in the mosque, they should be behind a curtain. And, of course, the men were like, oh, he's from Saudi Arabia, so he must know. And so one day I came to the mosque, and there was like this shower curtain thing, and the women were told to pray behind it. And I was like, yeah, no. This never happened in the time of the Prophet. There were no shower curtains or walls. Like, we prayed in the same hallway. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and you're only believing it because he's from Saudi Arabia. And back in those days, Saudi Arabia had this sort of, people thought they were right about stuff. And so I'm like, no, this isn't going to happen, and I'm going to prove you guys wrong. And I told the National Film Board, I want to make a documentary called Me in the Mosque, and I want to go and talk to proper Islamic scholars that this guy's wrong. And he's bringing sort of this misogyny and patriarchy into our community, and it doesn't exist in our faith, and I want to prove it. And they're like, this is good, go out and do it. So I traveled across the country, and I talked to Islamic scholars, and they all agreed with me that like, what he's saying is wrong. This is sort of patriarchal, messages that come from hundreds of years ago where, women are subjugated, and it's all legitimized through faith, and religion is used to legitimize it, but it doesn't actually exist in faith. And people who don't understand faith can easily get dissuaded. So I proved it from the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet that he was wrong, and I made a documentary called Me in the Mosque, and it was about that. It was about that was a scholar at the bottom from Kuwait who was very heavyweight, and so I had all these heavyweight scholars saying what's happening in mosques is wrong today, and we have to reverse this trend. And it worked. People started showing these at mosques, and the whole the debate about men and women and mixed circles started happening. And as this sort of happened, the National Film Board said to me, we'd like you to go to the Banff Television Festival where we're going to present this documentary to other people, right? So I said, okay. And they're like, it was crazy, right? Banff Television Festival is a really expensive place, and people go there. And they were willing to pay like 2 or 3 days accommodations. And I was like, what am I going to do once I show this documentary? Like, what am I going to do for the other 2 days? My friend was like, traditionally, people go to this television festival to pitch TV shows. And it would be good if you want to take advantage of the time to pitch a TV show. And I was like, oh, I've never considered that before. Because back in those days, Canada wasn't known for having sitcoms. We were known for, I think, 2, King of Kensington. Do you guys remember that? And The Beachcombers. That was it. That was all we had. And so everyone kept saying, for some reason, Canada just can't do it. We just can't do it. We don't have the ability to do it like the way the U.S. does, So, but they were always trying to get, Canadian filmmakers to pitch. And so I thought, okay, fine, I will pitch a television show. And in my mind, I thought, what if there was an imam who understood their faith but didn't grow up in a country like Saudi Arabia, grew up in Canada where gender equity is important and is part of our culture? How would that change things in a mosque? How would that change things for the conservative men or for the women and the kids? How would that whole dynamic work its way out? So it was in my mind because I had just done this documentary. So I came up with this idea of an imam who was a lawyer in Toronto who gives up his career and moves to Saskatchewan. Because I had grown up in Toronto and had moved to Saskatchewan. So that was kind of like the whole fish out of water scenario. And I created all these characters. And the CBC was really interested in it. And they thought, wow, this is, Muslims are always in the zeitgeist, but always in a negative way. And now here you are with someone from the community who understands it from an organic sense, in the grassroots sense. We'd like to take this and put it into production and development. And so we shot the pilot, and lo and behold, the U.S. got a hold of, realized somehow it got leaked that Canada was doing a comedy about Muslims, right? And this was in 2005 when the big issue with the Danish cartoon controversy happened in Europe, and people were very angry. And so people assumed that Muslims couldn't handle comedy. And they thought, well, what's Canada doing, right? Like, they're not even doing like a Cosby Show couch in a living room family. They're doing like in a mosque about religion, about comedy. And they're insane. Like there's no way Canada will survive a terrorist attack. And so they started writing articles in New York Times and CNN, and we got this insane amount of publicity, so much so that the Canadian media started paying attention, because it's really hard to get Canadian media to pay attention to Canadian shows. And we just don't have the ad dollars that America, like, the reason Canadians watch American shows is because they have, they're like a country of 300 million, they have millions of dollars of ad, to flood our markets. And so we're not even aware of what our country produces. We're mostly aware of what, this is before Netflix and all that. Like, this is just the main broadcasters like ABC and CBS and NBC. So they dominated the Canadian airspace. And this was, I don't know if you guys remember that show, How to Become a Millionaire. Do you remember that? Those were the big blockbuster shows. And so we are existing in that time frame. But suddenly, because the whole world is suddenly focusing on us, we had all this, we ended up getting millions and millions of unpaid ad dollars from all the media attention. So by the time we aired, it was like we had the same, CBC had the highest ratings it had since Anne of Green Gables 20 years earlier, because that's how high the ratings were. And they're like, oh my God. And so we were able to use that to sustain the show. And at the same time, Corner Gas was airing on CTV. So there were two shows simultaneously, CTV and CBC, that were at the highest levels. And we were beating out the American shows for the first time in Canadian history. We had sitcom success. And it gave the whole Canadian industry this boost that it desperately needed, that we could do it, that we could compete against American programming, and Canadians were willing to watch Canadian shows. And plus, we were training writers to write, because that's what we had lacked at that time, were shows where Canadian writers could train themselves to learn to write story and comedy in a place. They needed that training ability. And so that show ended up, that ended up being a huge hit for Canada. But then what was interesting was that Europe started calling and saying, we'd like to air this show. And I said, sure, like what's the big deal? What we had inadvertently done was, even though I had created a show about, overcoming patriarchy and misogyny in my community, what they were seeing was something very different. They were seeing multiculturalism, which didn't really exist in Europe. They were seeing Muslims and Christians and people of different race and faiths existing in the same city, in the same house of worship, and they couldn't understand it. And that was when I realized that the history of immigration in North America has been very, very different than the history of immigration and migration in Europe. So I'll give you an example. Like when Germany was trying to rebuild after World War II, they brought in Turkish immigrants from Turkey, because that was very close. And they were brought in as temporary workers. They were not expected to stay. They didn't want them to stay. They housed them on the outskirts of the city. They didn't give them citizenship. But the rebuilding of the country took so long that generations ended up staying there, right? So then they would bring wives from back home, and the children would be born in these sort of ghettoized areas of Germany. The children wouldn't be given citizenship either, because nobody really wanted those immigrants to stay and be part of their... They wanted them to rebuild their country, but they didn't want them to be part of their country. But if you do that for generations, you end up getting children who have no access to upward mobility, because they're not citizens, so they're not allowed to go to university. They can't get jobs other than, very, very low labor jobs, assuming those jobs are there. They ended up having millions and millions of Muslim immigrants living in ghettoized areas without access to university education or upward mobility. And so then you have this very depressed population that's not really welcome or wanted, and high levels of crime and unemployment. And so this was going on all over Europe. And in Europe also, started being afraid of Muslim immigrants, because they were becoming such a large part of their communities, and passing, laws against, like here we have laws about multiculturalism and reasonable accommodation and religious tolerance. Like, for example, I can wear the hijab. When I went to university, I wore it. When I went to high school, I wore it. They started saying, no, we're going to have net neutrality, that, nobody's allowed to express their, religious identity. So any girl who decides to wear a scarf will be removed from school, and she will not be allowed to have an education. And so girls dropped out, right, and then went underground. And so it's very similar to what the Taliban was doing in Afghanistan, right? Like, if a girl said, I want to wear this, they said they'll remove her from school, and then she would get a substandard education. So they were passing all these draconian laws. So Muslims in Europe have the highest rates of unemployment and the highest rates of crime, whereas Muslims in Canada, United States, have the same rates of employment and the same rates of education. And so Europeans had always assumed there was something wrong with Muslims, right? There's something defective about the community, and that's why they're having all these social problems. But then this show came out, and they started investigating North America, and they're like, oh, there's millions of Muslims living in this part of the world that are doing just fine, and yet ours are not. So what's the difference? And the difference is how you welcome an immigrant, the policies that you put in your country, the policies in which you allow children of immigrants like me to move upward, to become a citizen. So my father was allowed into Canada. He was given citizenship immediately and a job and regular housing. I was allowed to, we were allowed to practice our faith and be Muslims. I was allowed to cover my hair if I wanted to. The teachers back in those days thought it was a bit weird. And you could imagine in the 1980s, hijab was unknown. I was the only woman in my high school that wore it. Not like today where you go to Walmart and half of your cashiers are wearing it, right? So they thought it was really odd, but they're like, there was a policy of religious pluralism in this country, and that made it possible for people to come from all over the world and participate. And it didn't actually ghettoize people from different communities. What it made them feel like was that they could belong and participate and become an integral part of their country. And so I have a dual, identity. I'm a Canadian of Muslim faith. So when I went, to Europe, I would always say I'm Canadian, and they're like, that's so strange because we know, there have been people who have lived in France for generations who still say I'm Tunisian. They don't say I'm French. And the reason that is because they never felt like they belonged in France, because France has never allowed them the opportunity to feel like they're truly French, because they don't actually want them there. And so there's very different histories of migration for both countries, and they can cause a really deleterious effect for communities. And you can see the difference. And so this show ended up going across, around the world and showing a snapshot of what Canada was and what makes us successful as a country. And so now, we come full circle to today where we have Trump in the White House, and you see him trying to fan sort of those flames of partisanship and nationality and try to bring about that division. And so my father's grown up, and he knows what can happen when you do that, what can happen to your country, what can happen to your society when you start saying one color is better, one religion is better. When people who are neighbors who have lived together for generations can wake up one day and say, you don't belong here. And we're starting to see those videos that are going viral where you see people yelling at people of color saying, go back to your country, you don't belong here. Because you have a leader who's sort of, there's something about humanity and society where we have this feeling that, one group is superior to the other group and this other group doesn't really belong. And so he is starting to, we're starting to see those cracks happening even in our society here. And we saw those cracks happening when Harper was here, when he decided to make Muslims sort of the target and the enemy number one and the problem in our society. And so I guess my overriding lesson is that even though, we think we've come full circle and become much more enlightened, it's very easy to slip backwards and forget that. And it's happened to other countries like Rwanda and Yugoslavia, where ethnic and religious differences can destroy an entire country faster than you would think. And people know that, and people use that to get elected. And it's important to always remember those lessons of the past so that we won't repeat them, because they're being repeated again, especially in the United States, where we're seeing the highest levels of violence against people of color and being sanctioned by the highest levels of politicians in the government. And it's a dangerous thing, and I watch it very carefully because I come from a culture and a background where that destroyed, a country and my own family, which is the reason I'm here and not living where my parents would have preferred living. And so I guess, if I have anything to offer today, it's that to be vigilant and to be careful and to watch those messages and to be more critical of what you hear on the news and what you hear people saying. because it's very important if we want to live in a cohesive, pluralistic society. It's not about tolerance, it's about knowing each other and being aware of one another and how we live, and to be aware of that constantly, because peace is a very fragile thing, and it can be taken in a heartbeat, and it has been taken in a heartbeat for other people around the world. And I think we're at a precipice here in North America. Harper, last 4 years for Harper were a really scary time for my community, really, really, really scary for us. And we now have a new American president who's using the same rhetoric that was used in Canada just a little while ago. And so you have to watch that and be aware of it, and to, become knowledgeable about things like that, so that we can make sure that we live in a safe, democratic, pluralistic society where we are all safe. But anyway, I could go on and on. I ramble, as you know. But I believe my time is up. Was it? I have 5 minutes for questions. Sorry I couldn't leave you guys more time. Technical issues. Does anyone have any questions? Yes? My next project. Okay, so I wrote a comedy called Laughing All the Way to the Mosque. That was a memoir. So after that, I said, no more memoirs. I wanted, because my kids are like, they're tired of being exposed. So I promised them, I said, okay, fine, I'll write a novel. So I just wrote a novel about a Muslim woman. So my stuff is very autobiographical. So I wrote a novel about a Muslim woman who wrote a memoir that did not go to #1 in the New York Times list. So she's very upset. And she tells God, like, if I'm going to, belong to a religion which, where you pray 5 times a day, then I expect action. I do not expect to be stuck at the bottom of these lists. So she starts to pray. Figures she can do like some God coercing. It doesn't work, so she goes to the local imam, this poor imam who's just arrived from Egypt, who doesn't understand Western ways, about how Western people think that they can be so aggressive as to force God into making God do their bidding. And so he tells her to go help the homeless and become a better person. And so they go out and they meet a homeless person who decides to convert, and the imam is so happy, right? But it turns out that he wants to join this Middle Eastern group that's talking about saving the world. And he leaves, and they report him to the police, and then suddenly the imam disappears because the police feel he has a connection to that group. And so you're sort of getting a sense of what I'm talking about. So of course I couldn't call that group ISIS, so I decided I need to change their name. So I decided to call them the Dominion of the Islamic Caliphate in Kingdoms. So that would be Dick, for those of you. So she joins. She has to pretend she got radicalized and join Dick so that she can bring her poor imam back for being so selfish. And she becomes the first Westerner who they're trying to get rid of because she's actually destroying the movement. So it's called The Rise and Fall of Dick. So we'll see. It's out right now. Various New York agencies are reading it flabbergasted, right? So if I can actually get that book published and into your hands, yes, that is my next goal, is to write. And then in that book is sort of the history of American imperialism in the Middle East and what they did actually to cause this group to form. Because this doesn't have to form. It's through very, stupid acts like destroying Iraq and creating power vacuums and chaos and destroying. 1/3 of Iraq's population is either dead or exiled or injured because of all these wars that didn't have to happen. And so so it's a comedy, but it's also kind of, I've put in there an explanation that explains why we're in the state we're in. So we'll see. Just before I came here, I was sending the manuscript off to an agent who's like, wow, send me the rest of the book. So that's how you get a book published, is you have to send query letters out to agents and wait for one of them to want it. So hopefully. We'll see if we can keep the title, guys. Sorry, was there anybody else? I think when I first started, they were a little bit shocked. Yeah, they were not happy. They were like, "What's happening?" Because they feel that there's so much bad, negative publicity about Islam and Muslims that the only way to counter it is to have very serious documentaries and very serious programming, and then people will see us as real human beings. So when the show first came out, and I was sort of showing all the goofy things that we do and all the mistakes that we make and the arguments and fights. They're like, oh my God, if people see this, people will think that we're really dumb and that they'll hate us even more. And so they were really scared and they were really, really worried. And what happened, which was great for me, was that all these non-Muslims came up to them and say, oh my God, you know, we have a character just like that in our church or in our synagogue, or we tried to get rid of the president of our soccer association the same way you guys tried to get rid of your imam. And that really surprised Muslims, right? Because what ended up happening was it showed the full humanity of Muslims, right? Because on the news and television, you see this one, you know, extreme end, and you never see like the 99.9% of the community. And that show exposed the world to the rest of the community. And it showed people just paying their bills and raising children and paying their mortgages and just dealing with the, you know, the nitty-gritty of life that you never see a Muslim doing ever on television. And so that really helped non-Muslims relate to Muslims, and that helped Muslims realize that this wasn't a catastrophe that they thought it was going to be. So it took about 2 years for them to come around, but after about after the first 2 years, they were like, yes, you know, we can understand the value of this show. But it was a huge shock. Yeah, they were scared. So sorry, there was somebody here, yeah. My father. You know, it's so funny because it took me a long time to understand, but what my father really was saying to me was that women have so much potential in life, and their potential, career and intelligence and, you know, job-wise, tends to be sublimated with looking after a husband and children. That's what he was really saying. And what he wanted for me was to be able to fulfill my potential as whatever, you know, in his mind it would be a doctor, but what he ended up seeing was that I was fulfilling my potential as a story maker, that I was, you know, I had a dream to make story and write books and to make television shows, and that they were coming true, and that being married to a very supportive husband and having kids had not actually stopped me from being a creator of stuff. And that's what he really wanted. He didn't want my life to be I was stymied and at home and not doing anything. And as long as I was out in the world and producing, that's what he wanted to see, was that as a human being, my potential as a woman hadn't been reduced. And I think that's a human experience, right, for all women, is that when we get married and have children, there's just so many people who have so many demands of us, and we have this, you know, feeling of wanting to take care of other people that we forget about our own needs and our own goals. And that's what he wanted. He wanted to make sure that that had never happened to me. And then as he saw my career do well, and, you know, he comes to a lot of these talks. He's actually in Switzerland visiting my brother, or he would actually be here right now. They love this presentation, right? And for my mom, she just wanted, you know, like mothers wanted to be married to someone good and supportive, and she wanted grandchildren, which she got, right? So I think they both got what they wanted, which is good. So it ended up well. Sorry, yes? I think, yeah, you're right about comedy. Like when we were doing the shows, if we would do an episode where we were making fun of Muslims, the Muslims wouldn't like it. But then the next week, if we made, you know, fun of white people, the white people wouldn't like it, right? So we would have to keep targeting different groups in every episode so that it would be an equal opportunity. So one group wasn't saying she's picking on us too much, or she's picking on the conservative Muslims too much, or she's picking on this group too much. And so we would sort of keep the variety, because, you know, we would get people riled up in the Muslim community, but then suddenly we were a moving target. Because every week there'd be another episode. So there would be Muslims who were trying to get people enraged at me and trying to, you know, get the petitions going. But then the next week people would say, yeah, but that episode was kind of good, and I laughed, and I kind of liked it, right? Then they would lose their steam, and then it would be... And so after a while, people sort of let down their guard and just started enjoying the show. And it took a while for both communities to just say, okay, let's just all relax, because they had never seen this type of comedy before, right? With Muslims and Christians worshiping in the same building and taking shots at each other. And so that was something that was very new and very different for all groups. And it bothered sort of the right-wing establishment who didn't like this, because they were like, she's humanizing Muslims. She's making them feel safe and normal and calm so that they'll get into our society and make them trust us, and then at the right time they'll all stand up and stab us to death, right? So that's what they were saying, like, don't listen to her, this shouldn't be allowed. And it was so interesting to see that sort of reaction. And even with right-wing Muslims, they were like, because I had a lot of stuff about gender equity and, female empowerment. And so, that was threatening sort of their authority, right? Because I could go beyond the pulpits on the Friday sermons. Because, this was before, Facebook and Twitter and, the only access you had to large people were either, you were the imam or you created a television show, right? And so all the things that I believed in my faith and believed should be out there, I would just put in the mouth of the imam and have him say the things I believed, right? And so suddenly they were like, oh my God, like she's threatening our authority through a sitcom of all places. She's created an imam in a show and she's making him say all the things she believes. And so it was really scary for that group of people, right? So a lot of people were threatened by this comedy, like you're saying, and it's true, comedy is very, very powerful. And it has the way to tell, speak power to, speak truth to the power. And that power, and when people are laughing, it's hard to criticize it. And so I was able to do a lot of things at once, and deal with a lot of subject matter and issues that were affecting me. I was getting it out there through the show. So it was a very powerful tool. Sitcoms can be a very powerful tool, for sure. Thank you so much. And grab the president. That worked really well.
I hate to jump in. I know there are some more questions, but I just want to offer our thanks to Zarka. Thank you, Zarka, for offering us a glimpse into your story and your art, and ultimately reminding us of the power of humor and intersectionality and relationship and belonging. This time has been so rich, and if you want to continue hearing from Zarka or speak with her, you can catch her a few times tomorrow. She will be speaking at our worship service, our celebration here in the main stage at 10:30, and she'll also be offering a second talk tomorrow in the afternoon after worship, and we'll be around, I guess, for a little bit for the remainder of this afternoon if you want to catch her after this talk. So thank you so much. In terms of what's coming up next, in a few moments, about 10 minutes, we have Rochelle and Hillary from Christian Peacemaker teams who are offering a session here at the main stage. You can catch Anna Galladay at the Market Building at 1:15. Sammy Duke is just starting now over at the Agriplex, and Bible Meets Broadway will be in the Edge tent shortly. As well, there's the giant storybook out in the field and the Skylight installation. You can share your Skylight moments and reflections there. See y'all in a bit.